Hello there, guys. This is Christy Lewis from Dostoevsky in Space. Today we're going to be talking about Banned Book Club, a graphic novel by Kim Hyun-Sook and Ryan Estrada, her husband. They're a husband and wife team, and this is a biography memoir of Kim Hyun-Sook's time as a college student in South Korea in the year 1983, and it's amalgamation of several students' stories, and it's set at a fictional university, all in an effort to protect identities. I loved this so much. I realize it's a banned book. It's actually been banned in Florida schools, and it was reinstated, but then it was banned elsewhere. That's really a shame because this is really not propaganda. It's not dangerous. It's kind of a free thinker book. It's all about teaching students to think for themselves rather than going along with what they're just told, which is part of becoming an adult. That's a healthy way of becoming an adult. So that's completely appropriate for teenagers to be reading. This is fabulous. So let's get into it. So this is following a group of college students who form an illegal banned books club at their college because they are aware that the government has been lying to them about various things, which I'll be talking about a little bit later in this review. But this student that's on the front here, Kim Hyun-Sook, she just wants to go to school and get an education, but because of when she is going to school, she doesn't really have a choice but to deal with the politics of the situation, because politics are affecting her school, her students, her friends, and she is actually trying to educate herself, which you can't really do if half of the information about reality and political realities specifically are being banned from so that you can't read them. So just as an example, the government in power at the time that this is set is a right-wing, super authoritarian government, to the point where they are banning works about both communism and democracy. It's banning books about democracy because the government knows that if the students find out the actual definition of democracy, they will know that they do not have it. So books about democracy, books about communism, they are being called communists because they are opposing the government, and anybody opposing the government is considered an enemy. A communist could be tortured to death. Like, literally, students actually did die in torture. At least one student died under torture by the police. Basically, they're like, well, they're calling us communists, but we don't even know what that is. Like, we don't have a definition of it. The definition probably isn't just anytime you disagree with the government, you're a communist. Basically, these students are trying to figure out what is communism, what is democracy, and so they read a lot of books that have been banned in South Korea. They get their news and everything from outside of the country because their news is so censored. One thing that was really interesting that I learned through this is that the government was telling people, and actually this was something that was also mentioned in A History of Korea by Kyung, which these went great together, if anybody's curious. This was more in-depth, and this was obviously a graphic novel, but I feel like they went well together because this would give you more of, I guess, a historian's perspective and like multiple historians' perspectives, whereas this would give you one-liners that really would make you think. Like really great quotes that would make you think, and it would kind of portray what the period was like at the time, at least how this student felt about it. So one thing that was described in both of these was the Gwangju uprising, which was a massacre of basically protesters protesting the government that were so violently suppressed that hundreds, we don't even know how many, were killed. It was a bloodbath. And then the government, to kind of get away with having done that, it was like a military dictatorship at the time. The government decided to say, oh, it was the communists. We were protecting you from the communists. That's what this whole uprising was about. But that was taking place during Kim Hyun-Sook's parents' time. But by her time in college, it was really the kids' generation that was most affected by that incident, because there were leaked written accounts of what actually happened by witnesses. There were photos, there was even video footage of what actually happened at the Gwangju uprising. And so because the government had done that to protesters for no other reason than because they were protesting, that is really what set these students off, and it made them really determined to make change in their government. That violence actually ended up invalidating the rule of Korea's military leaders. So they had several dictators that were, elected, but they were dictators, and they controlled everything. They controlled the media and, like I said, violently suppressed protest movements. So yeah, that's basically what these students were dealing with. So the students are the good guys here. I know that some of the reasons why people complained about it was that it was anti-police, and the students mentioned making Molotov cocktails. But the reason why the students were anti-police and why they were making Molotov cocktails was because they had experienced violence from the police. And obviously these students were not dangerous, other than they had ideas that the government did not like. So for example, one of the stories in here was that her friend, one of the women protesters, she wanted the student council to be fair so that she could be in charge of the student council. And when she started protesting, because the students in charge of the student council were people who were reporting back to the police, spies, they were spying on the other students and the staff at the school. And so that's why they had their position of authority in the student council, and she thought that was totally unfair. And so the police pulled her in for questioning, and they ended up raping her. So that's the kind of policing that these kids are dealing with, and that's why that they are anti-police. And there's a later section in the book that as they are grown-ups and things have changed for Korea in some ways, they are not anti-police anymore because the police are not violently suppressing them under the military dictatorship's orders. It's really important with books like this not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think it probably is somewhat left-leaning. I'm just reading an interview with the authors and stuff like that, but it's mostly about thinking for yourself and not just going with the flow, which is definitely something that our young people absolutely need to hear. I feel like our young people have been really inundated with everybody else's opinion, and they feel like they have to go along with it, like on social media and stuff. It's important for kids to realize that there are complex ideas out there and that they have to do research and think for themselves in order to come to any conclusion. And that's why it's important not to ban books, especially for kids who are getting to that point of critical thinking and becoming adults and learning to not be lazy about it and just go with the crowd, but learning to actually think for themselves. This is like a really inspiring book in that sense, because that's what these college students are doing. They're just not going with the crowd. They're trying to learn for themselves. But it's really refreshing because since they are college students, there are moments where they have their contradictions. One of the college students, he's like, I'm anti-capitalist, so I'm never going to buy a Nike, I'm never going to buy Nike brand shoes. So he just gets white shoes and draws the Nike symbol on them. And one of his friends is like, isn't that like ultra capitalist though, to actually care enough about a name brand to draw it onto your shoes? So there's funny things that, kind of, it set off any sort of tension that I was feeling as I was reading this. Like, is this basically just convincing kids that communism is the right way to go? No, communism was the thing that was being presented as the enemy to this group of college students, and they didn't even know what it was. So they're just trying to figure out what is communism. That's why they were reading all of these books by like Che Guevara and stuff like that. I think this was fabulous. I would highly recommend it. I would especially recommend it alongside a book like History of Korea by Hwang, because they went hand in hand really, really well. And something really refreshing about this book is that by the end, the author, Kim Hyun-Sook, she enters this school and is kind of pulled into this banned book club by her friends. They make all the decisions. People start making lots of decisions for her, her parents, everybody, the government. And she gets so sick of that by the end, she's just like, no, I can't just go along with what they're all doing because this is my life. I have to decide what's right, and I have to decide it for myself and do what I want to do. So I really thought that was really refreshing to see that actually individualistic thought coming from a young person. Like, I think this is a great book to be in the hands of young people, honestly. This book was also really interesting in how it discussed, like, history and political thought. Like, there's a literature professor, for example, in here where he's talking about Shakespeare and how Shakespeare, you didn't really think Shakespeare was apolitical, did he? Yes, he was writing plays for the Queen, but he also like wrote Richard III and had it performed as a protest, you know, to some of the things that were happening in government. Even he was just writing about kings that were 100 years old so that he wouldn't get arrested or something. Like, he was trying to avoid censorship while also getting his point across, but his works were not apolitical. And that's definitely a takeaway from this book, is that when you're living in times of turmoil, you can't really run away from politics entirely. You kind of have to get your mind wrapped around the issues that are really important, because nothing is really entirely apolitical. It also talked about a really important concept that I've kind of heard referenced before, but I didn't remember reading a definition. Maybe I probably have, but it didn't really stick with me whenever I read it, which is the bread and circuses method of keeping the population content, even though there's corruption and things going on with the government. Bread and circuses is basically when the government is misbehaving, but it wants to prevent everybody from knowing that and talking about that in the population, it will give them things to entertain them so that they will basically shut up about what the government is actually doing. In Korea, an example of this would be that the Yusin era government, which was an earlier government to the one that's being talked about here, but I'll talk about why it's still important later on. Korea was called an economic miracle because of all the industrialization that it brought on, and then the post-industrialization that went on, which again is something that I learned quite a bit about in this book, and also from watching Reborn Rich, just researching Reborn Rich, the K-drama. The government did amazing things for the people in that sense, and boosting the economy kind of made people be quiet about the human rights abuses that were happening despite that. But eventually, people decided that progress at the expense of human rights isn't really progress. So they kind of saw past this whole bread and circuses argument that the government was trying to make to them. So like examples of progress at the expense of human rights that were cited in this book, one of them was that factory workers were forcibly injected with amphetamines. Sorry, my hand's getting tired. I'm just gonna put this down. So that they wouldn't fall asleep during their shifts at factories. Hey guys, so I just spent about 20 minutes just Googling around and seeing if I could find like an easy source to verify that workers were forcibly injected with amphetamines. And this would have been in like the 60s or so in South Korea. I couldn't find any sources that said that, but that's not really surprising since I was just Googling in English and this happened in Korea. So I'm sure the author has access to more sources. She speaks Korean, obviously, and can read and research in Korean. So just because I couldn't confirm it doesn't mean it's not true. We do know that conditions for workers were terrible at that time in Korea. So an example of a worker who was protesting, and this is a viable instance of Jong Tae-il, who actually set himself on fire and killed himself as a protest in order to draw attention to the plight of workers in South Korea. And you wouldn't do that, right? Unless the conditions were really bad. And like eventually the Korean people started to see the costs of the corruption. Like in the 90s, a department store collapsed, killing just like hundreds of people in South Korea. And it was because of shoddy workmanship that got passed through because of bribes. And so Korea has always, ever since they started industrializing, they've had these moments of collective panic as a country that just made them really question what the cost is of their rapid industrialization and expansion and then post-industrialization. One of the many great quotes from this graphic novel was that progress is not a straight line, do not take it for granted. And I think that's especially true with Korea. I mean, it's true for everybody. We can't look back with chronological snobbery. Sometimes there are moments of progress, there's moments of decline, and Korea has had lots of moments like this where they are collectively reassessing. And in fact, at the end of this graphic novel, the daughter of one of their previous dictator presidents actually was elected as president, and then a ferry disaster happened under her rule, and then she was later actually impeached and then imprisoned in 2017 for corruption. And so this kind of work is very important to Korea. Like, protest literature is an extremely relevant portion of their history and literature, and this graphic novel mentioned all kinds of books from Korean authors, just writings that I had never heard of and a couple that I had heard of. So I'm excited to check some of those out, so I thought I would just list them off for you here in case you're interested, and I will have them down in the description below, as well as links to some articles that I did for research, as well as a link to a free documentary about the Gwangju uprising that's here on YouTube, which I found really fascinating. So some of the books that were mentioned was Cry of the People and Other Poems by Kim Ji-ha, Rhee Young-hee's Logic for an Era of Transition, Two Treatises of Government by John Locke, Kkokjong by Myong-Hui, and A Song That Cannot Be Erased by Jeong-Hwan. So yeah, in conclusion, I just thought these went really, really well together. And because A History of Korea was published, I think, in like 2010, whereas Banned Book Club was published in 2020. So I hadn't heard about the impeachment and imprisonment of their female president that was the daughter of an earlier ruler. So pretty amazing. I just am loving learning about Korean history. Let me know down below if you have any recommendations for me about Korean history, because I'm really interested in reading more. I hope that you enjoyed this review, and I hope that you will check out Banned Book Club. Thanks so much for watching. Take care. Bye.